Chapter 1, Foundations of Glass. The late afternoon sun bled through the tall windows of the university library, casting long, amber stripes across the blueprints spread out on the table. Mason Silverton traced the outline of a master bedroom with his fingertip, a small, subconscious smile tugging at his lips. 3 windows, he whispered to himself. We need the morning light for your plants, and enough wall space for the bookshelves. He and Alexander had been building this dream for a year. It wasn't just a move, it was an escape. After graduation, they were leaving the suffocating familiarity of their college town for a high-rise in the city. Every detail was curated, the charcoal gray sofa, the espresso machine they'd saved for, the way their names looked side by side on a mock lease. Alexander Langdon was the anchor Mason had always prayed for, steady, brilliant, and devastatingly handsome. A buzz from his pocket broke the trance. It was a text from Alexander. Mace, I'm a disaster. Forgot the blue folder for my senior seminar. It's on my desk. Can you grab it? Doors unlocked. Love you, Savior. Mason chuckled, shaking his head. Alexander, for all his artistic genius, could be hopelessly scattered. He packed his things and made the short trek to Alexander's off-campus apartment. The air in Alexander's place always smelled like cedarwood and expensive ink. It was a space Mason usually loved, it felt like the womb of Alexander's creativity. But today, the apartment felt strangely heavy, the air-conditioned chill biting through Mason's light sweater. Folder, Mason drifted toward the mahogany desk, which was a chaotic sea of charcoal sticks, crumpled sketches, and architectural drafts. He began sifting through the mounds of paper. He moved a sketchbook and a stack of reference photos, his eyes scanning for the blue plastic tab. As he lifted a heavy stack of watercolor paper, the edge of his sleeve caught a loose sheaf of drawings. They slid off the desk, fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. Damn it, Mason muttered, kneeling to retrieve them. He picked up the first few, mostly anatomical studies, the usual high-quality work he expected from Alexander. But the third page made his breath hitch. It was a storyboard, rendered in sharp, aggressive ink strokes. It wasn't a landscape or a still life. It was a gay romance, but the romance felt like a lie. The figures were entwined, but the body language was violent. One figure, who bore a haunting, stylized resemblance to Mason himself, was pinned down, his face a mask of genuine, agonizing terror. The other figure, looming and dominant, had a coldness in his eyes that made Mason's skin crawl. It's just art, Mason's inner voice whispered, though his heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Artists explore dark themes. It doesn't mean anything. Then he saw the next page. The imagery was graphic, bordering on the grotesque. It depicted acts that weren't just kinky, they were dehumanizing. There were sketches of bruising, of forced positions, and dialogue bubbles filled with words that made Mason's stomach turn. These weren't the actions of 2 people in love. This was a blueprint for a victim. Mason's hand began to shake so violently the paper rattled. We don't do this, he thought, his mind racing through their year together. Alex is gentle. He's the one who holds me when I'm stressed. He's the one who bought me that weighted blanket for my anxiety. But as he looked at the drawings again, he noticed the details. The mole on the victim's shoulder. The exact shape of Mason's favorite watch on the victim's wrist. This wasn't a generic fantasy. This was a storyboard featuring him. The sound of the apartment door creaking open sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through his system. Mace? You in here? Alexander's voice called out, warm, melodic, and perfectly normal. In a moment of blind, panicked instinct, Mason didn't put the paper back. He didn't confront him. He shoved the most graphic page into his messenger bag, burying it beneath his own notebooks. He stood up just as Alexander leaned against the doorframe, a tired but beautiful smile on his face. Found it? Alexander asked, nodding toward the blue folder now visible on the corner of the desk. Yeah, Mason said, his voice sounding thin and brittle to his own ears. He forced a smile, though his muscles felt like they were made of lead. Just found it. You're lucky I'm a good boyfriend. Alexander walked over, wrapping his arms around Mason's waist and pulling him into a firm hug. He buried his face in the crook of Mason's neck, inhaling deeply. The best, Alexander murmured. Normally, this touch felt like home. Today, Mason felt like he was being measured for a cage. He stared over Alexander's shoulder at the desk, wondering how many more secrets were hidden under the beautiful drawings of their future house. You okay? Alexander pulled back, his dark eyes searching Mason's face with alarming intensity. You're shaking. Just too much coffee, Mason lied, his heart screaming. I should get to class. As he walked out, the weight of the paper in his bag felt like a lead weight, a silent, inked promise of a nightmare he wasn't sure he could wake up from. Chapter 2, The Mask Slips. The days following the discovery felt like walking through a house where the floorboards had been replaced with thin ice. Every time Alexander laughed, Mason heard a phantom echo of the jagged ink lines on that hidden page. Every time Alexander reached for his hand, Mason had to suppress the urge to flinch. He's an artist, Mason told himself for the 1000th time, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. It's just a dark outlet. Stephen King isn't a murderer, right? But Stephen King didn't draw his own boyfriend with bruises on his wrists. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began with the sweet things. Alexander became more attentive, almost suffocatingly so. The texts were constant. Where are you? What are you eating? Who are you with, all wrapped in the guise of doting affection. Then came the night the ice finally cracked. They were in Mason's dorm room. The air was thick with the scent of the lavender incense Alexander had brought over, to help Mason relax. They were supposed to be studying, but the books had long since been pushed to the floor. You're so tense lately, Mace, Alexander whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum against Mason's ear. He was behind him, his arms wrapped around Mason's chest in a way that felt less like a hug and more like a restraint. You need to let go. Trust me more. I do trust you, Alex, Mason lied, his pulse thudding in his throat. Alexander's hands moved, trailing down to Mason's waist, his grip tightening. Then stop fighting me. Stop being so guarded. The transition into the bedroom was supposed to be the one place where the world fell away, but as they moved to the bed, the atmosphere shifted from warmth to something clinical and cold. Alexander wasn't looking at Mason's eyes, he was looking at his body like a canvas he was preparing to prime. When things began to escalate, the gentleness Mason had relied on for a year vanished. Alexander's movements were heavy, deliberate, and devoid of their usual rhythm. Alex, wait, that hurts, Mason gasped, his hand reaching back to push against Alexander's shoulder. It's fine, Alexander muttered, his voice sounding unrecognizable, deeper, raspier. He didn't slow down. In fact, the resistance seemed to fuel him. He pinned Mason's wrists above his head with a single, bruising hand. The image from the storyboard flashed in Mason's mind, the ink-black lines of the victim's wrists bound in the exact same position. A cold shiver of realization raced down his spine. He's not making love to me. He's staging a scene. Alex, please, slow down. I'm serious, stop for a second, Mason pleaded, his voice cracking. A tear slipped from the corner of his eye, blurring his vision. Alexander paused, but he didn't let go. He leaned down, his face inches from Mason's. He watched the tear track down Mason's temple with a look of intense, quiet fascination. There was no flicker of guilt, no, I'm sorry, honey. There was only a terrifying, predatory hunger. You look so beautiful when you're overwhelmed, Alexander whispered. He didn't stop. He pushed harder, his fingers digging into Mason's skin, leaving marks that would turn purple by morning. Mason stopped fighting. Not because he wanted it, but because the shock had paralyzed him. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ghost of the sketchbook page pressing against his back. He felt like he was disappearing, replaced by a character in Alexander's dark, twisted narrative. The next morning, the sun was cruelly bright. Alexander was in the kitchenette, humming a light tune as he brewed coffee. He looked like the man Mason fell in love with, the golden boy artist with a bright future. "Morning, sleepyhead," Alexander chirped, sliding a mug across the counter. Mason stayed in the doorway, clutching his robe tightly around his throat to hide the marks. His legs felt heavy, his joints aching with a dull, throbbing pain that made every step a chore. He could barely walk, and his lower back felt like it had been hammered. You were a lot last night," Mason said, his voice trembling. He wanted to sound firm, but he sounded small. Alexander didn't even look up from his phone. "I was just feeling inspired, Mace. We're moving in together soon. We should be exploring everything about each other, don't you think?" He looked up then, and for a split second, the mask slipped. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, I know you liked it. You were so quiet. So, obedient." The word obedient curdled the coffee in Mason's stomach. He looked at Alexander and realized the man across the counter wasn't his boyfriend. He was an actor playing a role, waiting for the moment he could finally drop the script and become the monster in the drawings. Mason reached into his bag, his fingers brushing against the crumpled paper he'd stolen. "I have to end this," he thought, even as a wave of terror threatened to drown him. Before the next page happens. Chapter 3, The Breaking Point. The air in the apartment felt thin, as if the walls were closing in to witness an execution. Mason stood by the kitchen island, his fingers trembling as they dipped into his messenger bag. He could feel the jagged edge of the stolen storyboard. It felt hot, like a live coal. Alexander was leaning against the counter, peeling an orange with methodical precision. The citrus scent was sharp and cloying. He looked so domestic, so safe, and the dissonance of it made Mason want to scream. "We need to talk about this," Mason said, his voice a jagged sliver of sound. He slapped the crumpled paper onto the marble countertop. The ink-drawn figures, the bound wrists, the weeping eyes, stared back at them in the harsh morning light. Alexander didn't flinch. He didn't even stop peeling the orange. He looked down at the drawing, then back up at Mason, his expression shifting from calm to something dangerously sharp. The silence stretched until it was a physical weight. "You went through my things, Mace," Alexander said softly. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "That's a breach of trust. We're moving in together. There aren't supposed to be secrets." "Trust?" Mason's laugh was brittle, bordering on hysterical. "You're talking about trust? Alex, look at this. Look at the marks on my arms right now. You're turning me into a character in your twisted little fantasy. I was crying last night. I told you to stop, and you. I was giving you what you wanted," Alexander interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. He stepped forward, the smell of orange peel replaced by the suffocating scent of his expensive cologne. "You just don't know it yet. You're repressed, Mason. You're scared of your own potential. I'm just drafting the blueprint for our new life. I don't want this life." Mason yelled, his voice breaking. "I want the man I met a year ago. I want the man who promised me a home, not a dungeon." Alexander's face suddenly distorted. The golden boy mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He slammed his hand onto the counter, inches from Mason's face. "This is the home, Mason. The drawings, the scenes, they are the only way I can truly possess you. Don't you see? I've been holding back for a year. I've been so patient." He reached out, his thumb dragging roughly over Mason's bottom lip. "In the city, we won't have neighbors to hear you. We can do exactly what's on the next 5 pages. I've already bought the equipment." The word equipment sent a surge of pure, primal terror through Mason's limbs. He saw it then, the future wasn't a high-rise with bookshelves, it was a soundproof room where his voice would never matter. "You're sick," Mason whispered. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his bag and bolted. He shoved past Alexander, the orange peel crunching under his sneaker. "Mason! Get back here!" Alexander's roar echoed in the hallway, no longer the voice of a lover, but of a hunter. Mason hit the stairs at a dead run, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He burst through the apartment complex's glass doors into the chilly afternoon air. He could hear the heavy thud of Alexander's footsteps behind him. "Mason, don't be dramatic. We're talking about this." Mason didn't look back. He ran toward the campus square, his vision blurred by hot, stinging tears. He was so focused on the sound of the pursuit that he didn't see the figure stepping out from behind a parked SUV. Oof. Mason slammed into a solid chest. Arms instinctively reached out to steady him. "Whoa, easy there. Mason." Mason looked up, gasping for air. Standing there was Kevin, a guy he'd worked with on a theater project a year ago. Kevin's face was a map of concern, his brow furrowed behind his glasses. "Kevin, please." Mason choked out, clutching Kevin's jacket. "Help me." Alexander rounded the corner of the SUV, skidding to a halt. He immediately tried to smooth his hair, pulling his charming persona back over his head like a shroud. "Mace, babe, come on," Alexander said, breathing heavily but forced a smile. "We just had a misunderstanding." "Sorry, man," he nodded at Kevin, his eyes cold as flint. "He's just having a bit of a panic attack. I've got him." Alexander reached out to grab Mason's arm. Mason shied away, hiding behind Kevin's shoulder. "No," Mason hissed, his voice trembling. "Don't let him touch me." Kevin felt the way Mason was shaking, a deep, rhythmic tremor that spoke of bone-deep fear. He looked at Alexander's outstretched hand, then at the dark, blooming bruises peeking out from under Mason's sleeve. Kevin stepped firmly between them, his posture shifting into something protective and unyielding. "He said no, Alexander," Kevin said, his voice low and steady. "I think you should go home." "This is none of your business, Kevin," Alexander spat, the facade crumbling again. "He's my boyfriend. We have a life together." "He doesn't look like a boyfriend right now," Kevin countered, his eyes hardening. "He looks like a man who's terrified of you. Walk away. Now. Or I'll make a scene right here in front of the campus security office." Alexander looked around, realizing they were near a high-traffic area. He pointed a finger at Mason, a silent, terrifying promise in his eyes. "This isn't over, Mason. You can't run from the plans we made." He turned on his heel and walked away, his gait stiff with suppressed rage. Mason collapsed against Kevin's side, his legs finally giving out. Kevin caught him, lowering him gently to the pavement. "I've got you," Kevin whispered, shielding Mason from the stares of passing students. "I've got you, Mason. You're safe." But as Mason looked at the retreating back of the man he'd loved for a year, he knew the nightmare hadn't ended. It had only just moved into the shadows. Chapter 4, The Shadow in the Hallway. The following week felt like living inside a fractured bell, every sound was amplified, every vibration carried a warning. Mason had moved into a temporary dorm room, a sterile box of a space that smelled of industrial floor wax and old textbooks. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, but as the sun dipped below the horizon on the third night, the silence began to scream. The first gift arrived on Tuesday. Mason found it sitting outside his door, a small, elegant box wrapped in charcoal gray paper, the exact color of the sofa they had planned to buy. Inside was a single, high-end fountain pen and a note in Alexander's impeccable, sweeping script, "For the next chapter of our story. You can't leave the ink dry, Mace." Mason's stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. He dropped the box as if it were made of searing coals. "He shouldn't know I'm here," Mason whispered to the empty room. He had told the housing office it was an emergency. He had blocked Alexander's number. But the digital wall was paper-thin. Ping. An email notification lit up his laptop. No subject. Just an attachment. Mason clicked it before his brain could scream no. It was a photo of the back of his own head, taken from across the campus quad earlier that afternoon. He was walking with Kevin. The caption was a single line, "You look distracted. Focus on us." He's watching, Mason realized, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp wheeze. He's always watching. The psychological warfare intensified. It wasn't just messages, it was a physical haunting. One evening, as Mason walked back from the library, he saw the silhouette of a man standing under a street lamp near his building. The figure was motionless, hands in his pockets, head tilted at that specific, curious angle Alexander used when he was studying a painting. Mason bolted inside, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, not stopping until he had engaged both the deadbolt and the security chain. Kevin became his only lifeline. He would show up with takeout containers of spicy noodles and a calm, grounded presence that acted as an anchor. "He's losing it, Mason," Kevin said one night, sitting on the floor of the dorm room as Mason paced the small rug. Kevin's eyes followed him, filled with a mixture of pity and protective fury. "This isn't love. It's a siege. We need to go to the police. Now." "I can't, Kevin," Mason cracked, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "What do I tell them? That he's sending me pens and standing in the shadows? They'll say he's a heartbroken ex-boyfriend. They won't see the drawings. They won't feel the way he looks at me, like I'm a piece of clay he hasn't finished molding." "The drawings are the evidence of intent," Kevin insisted, reaching out to grab Mason's hand to stop his pacing. "And the bruises on your arms are fading, Mace. We have to do it before the evidence disappears." "I just want it to be graduation," Mason sobbed, finally collapsing onto the edge of the bed. "I just want to walk across that stage and disappear. If I provoke him with a police report, he'll snap. I know him. He likes to be the director. If I take the script away, he'll burn the whole theater down." Kevin sighed, a heavy, frustrated sound. "I'm staying on the couch tonight. Don't argue with me." But the shadow outside didn't go away. Throughout the night, Mason's phone buzzed with "no caller ID" notifications. Every time he drifted into a fitful sleep, he dreamt of ink, thick, black ink pouring out of Alexander's mouth, drowning him, turning his skin into parchment. At 3 a.m., Mason crept to the window and peeled back the corner of the blind. The street lamp was flickering. Down on the sidewalk, a flash of white caught his eye. Someone had taped a piece of paper to the lamp post directly facing his window. Mason grabbed a flashlight and squinted. Even from the third floor, he recognized the bold, aggressive strokes of charcoal. It was a sketch of a bird in a cage. The cage door was open, but the bird's wings were pinned to its sides with heavy, black bolts. Beneath it, a single word was scrawled in red, "Soon." Mason backed away from the window, the flashlight slipping from his numb fingers and clattering to the floor. That "soon" wasn't a threat, it was a countdown. Alexander wasn't just stalking him, he was waiting for the grand finale of his storyboard. Chapter 5, The Night of the Storm. The sky over the campus was the color of a fresh bruise, deep purples and sickly yellows, as a spring storm rolled in. The wind rattled the window frames of Mason's dorm, a rhythmic thump-thump that sounded too much like a heartbeat. Kevin had been called away for a mandatory capstone presentation. "I'll be back by 9, he'd promised, his hand lingering on Mason's shoulder. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. Not even if he says he's dying." Mason had nodded, but the silence that followed Kevin's departure was cavernous. He tried to study, but the words on the page blurred into black lines that looked like Alexander's sketches. Every creak of the building made him jump. To calm his nerves, he went to the kitchenette to make tea, the whistle of the kettle masked by a sudden, violent crack of thunder. He never heard the door open. He didn't know Alexander had spent the last week befriending a freshman in the housing office, using his golden boy charm to obtain a spare key under the guise of surprising his boyfriend for their anniversary. Mason turned, mug in hand, and the porcelain shattered against the floor. Alexander was standing in the entryway. He was drenched from the rain, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead, his trench coat dripping onto the linoleum. He looked like a drowned saint, except for his eyes. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out until the iris was nothing but a thin ring of gold. "You changed your locks," Alexander said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a soft lilt that felt like a razor blade against skin. "That was hurtle, Mace. After all the plans we made for our kitchen." "Alex, get out," Mason whispered, his voice failing him. He backed away, his heels crunching on the broken ceramic of the mug. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling Kevin." "Kevin isn't part of the storyboard," Alexander said, stepping forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty black duct tape and a length of nylon cord. He set them on the counter with a gentle thud. "He's a distraction. A secondary character. He doesn't understand the aesthetic of us. There is no us." Mason screamed, lunging for his phone on the counter. Alexander moved with the predatory speed of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. He caught Mason by the throat, pinning him against the refrigerator with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. The cold metal of the fridge pressed against Mason's back while Alexander's body, hot and radiating a manic energy, crushed him from the front. Page 24, Alexander hissed into his ear, his breath smelling of rain and iron. "The bird stops flapping its wings. It realizes the cage is the only place it belongs. Please." Mason choked out, clawing at Alexander's wrists. "Alex, stop, this isn't you. This is the only me," Alexander snarled. He shoved Mason toward the bed. Mason scrambled to get up, but Alexander was on him instantly. The next hour was a blur of terror and sensory overload. The sound of the duct tape being ripped, a harsh, jagged shht, became the soundtrack to Mason's undoing. Alexander didn't just assault him, he choreographed it. He forced Mason into the exact positions from the sketches, his movements clinical and cruel. He didn't seem to care about Mason's pain, he only cared about the visual of it, the way the rope bit into Mason's skin, the way the tape silenced his pleas. "See?" Alexander whispered, leaning over a trembling, broken Mason as the storm raged outside. "This is art. This is forever. You're finally perfect." Mason's mind began to fracture. He looked at the ceiling, his vision swimming, and for a moment, he stopped feeling the pain. He felt like he was floating away, leaving the discarded shell of his body to the monster who claimed to love him. After what felt like an eternity, the weight shifted. Alexander stood up, adjusting his clothes with chilling composure. He looked down at Mason, tied, bruised, and staring blankly at nothing, and leaned down to kiss his forehead. "I have to go prepare the city apartment now," Alexander said, his voice back to its melodic, perfect boyfriend tone. "I'll come back for you when it's time to move. Don't go anywhere, Mace. We're finally starting our life." The door clicked shut. The deadbolt turned. Mason lay in the dark, the only sound the steady drip of the rain and the frantic, dying pulse in his ears. He was bound, he was broken, and he was utterly alone. Until, through the haze of his fading consciousness, he heard the sound of a key fumbling in the lock and a familiar, panicked voice. "Mason? Mason, I'm back. I saw his car in the lot, Mason." Chapter 6, The Longest Night. The silence following the click of the door was the loudest thing Mason had ever heard. It was a vacuum that swallowed the sound of the receding storm, leaving only the wet, ragged hitch of his own breath. He lay on the bed, his wrists and ankles burning where the nylon cord bit into his skin, his mouth sealed by the suffocating grip of the tape. He felt like a discarded mannequin. He stared at a single point on the ceiling, a small water stain shaped like a teardrop, and waited for his heart to simply stop. It felt like the only logical conclusion to the storyboard. Then, a frantic scraping at the door. The lock turned, not with the smooth, practiced hand of a captor, but with the desperate fumbling of a man in a panic. The door flew open, hitting the stopper with a crack that made Mason flinch so hard his entire body spasmed. Mason? Mason! Kevin's voice was a jagged blade of light cutting through the dark. He didn't even turn on the overhead light, the hallway's fluorescent glow spilled into the room, casting Kevin's shadow long and distorted across the floor. He saw the bed. He saw the ropes. He made a sound, a low, guttural animal noise of pure grief. Oh God! Oh, Mason! Kevin was at his side in a second. His hands were shaking, hovering over Mason as if afraid that touching him would cause him to shatter. I'm here. I'm here, Mace. I'm going to get this off. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't here. With a pocketknife he kept on his keychain, Kevin began to saw through the cords. He moved with a focused, terrifying intensity, his breath coming in sharp gasps. When the ropes finally snapped, Mason's limbs fell limp, the blood rushing back into his hands with a stinging, agonizing heat. The hardest part was the tape. Kevin peeled it back as gently as he could, his eyes glistening with tears. When Mason's mouth was finally free, he didn't scream. He didn't even speak. He just let out a long, broken wheeze and curled into a ball, hiding his face in his bruised arms. Don't look at me, Mason whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Please, Kevin. Don't look at what he did. I'm not looking at what he did, Kevin said, his voice cracking as he pulled a blanket over Mason's trembling frame. I'm looking at you. And you're still here. He didn't win, Mason. He didn't take you. For the next hour, time became a blurred sequence of trauma and care. Kevin didn't call the police immediately, he waited until Mason stopped shaking enough to breathe. He brought a warm washcloth and, with a tenderness that felt alien compared to the violence of the hour before, wiped the grime and tears from Mason's face. He's going to come back, Mason whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. He said he's preparing the apartment. He thinks I'm part of the furniture. Kevin sat on the edge of the bed, his expression hardening into something Mason had never seen before, a cold, granite resolve. He isn't going anywhere near you ever again. But Mason, look at me. Mason looked up. Kevin's eyes were fierce. We have to go to the hospital. And we have to call them. Right now. If we don't, he'll just keep writing the next chapter. We have to end the story here. Mason looked at his wrists, angry, purple welts that looked like permanent bracelets of shame. He thought of the storyboard, the way Alexander had looked at him like a project rather than a person. A spark of something, not quite strength, but a weary, desperate anger, flickered in his chest. Okay, Mason breathed. Call them. The hospital was a blur of white lights and clinical questions. The physical evidence was no longer just a drawing in a bag, it was written on Mason's skin in the language of bruises and abrasions. The police took photos. They took the storyboard. They took the fountain pen Alexander had left as a gift. As the sun began to rise, turning the hospital parking lot a pale, watery gray, an officer entered the waiting room where Kevin was pacing. We picked him up, the officer said. He was at his apartment. He didn't even resist. He just kept asking if we'd seen his latest work. Mason, sitting in a wheelchair with a hospital gown beneath his coat, felt a sudden, massive weight lift off his lungs. He looked at Kevin, who let out a sob of pure relief and dropped his head into his hands. The plans were over. The house with the 3 windows and the plants would never exist. But as Mason reached out to touch Kevin's arm, he realized for the first time that the air in the room didn't feel thin anymore. He was bruised, and he was broken, but the pen had been taken out of Alexander's hand. The story was finally his own again. Chapter 7, A Change of Latitude. The days leading up to graduation were a fever dream of fluorescent lights and hushed whispers. Mason moved through the university campus like a ghost haunting his own life. The arrest had made the local news, promising art student arrested in violent assault, and though the papers hadn't used Mason's name, the sympathetic stares from faculty and the way students cleared a path for him in the hallways told him that everyone knew. He lived out of a suitcase in Kevin's spare room. Every time a floorboard creaked or a phone vibrated, Mason's heart would leap into his throat, a reflex his body couldn't quite unlearn yet. Alexander was behind bars, denied bail due to the mountain of evidence and the trophy drawings found in his studio, but the walls of the city still felt like they were closing in. "I can't breathe here, Kev," Mason whispered one evening. They were sitting on Kevin's small balcony, watching the sunset bleed over the skyline. "Every street corner is a memory of a lie. That cafe is where we picked out the curtains. That park is where he told me he loved me for the first time. It's all tainted. It's all part of his script." Kevin stayed quiet, swirling the ice in his glass. He had been a silent sentinel for weeks, ensuring Mason ate, slept, and made it to his final exams. Graduation day arrived with a cruel, mocking brightness. Mason wore his cap and gown, feeling like he was wearing a costume. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he didn't look for his family or the cameras. He looked at his wrists, hidden under the heavy black fabric. The bruises had faded to a faint, yellowish green, but he could still feel the phantom pressure of the nylon cords. After the ceremony, amidst the sea of tossing caps and cheering families, Kevin pulled Mason aside. He looked nervous, his fingers fidgeting with a thick envelope. "The plans you had, the apartment in the city, the fresh start, they're gone, Mace," Kevin started, his voice steady but soft. "I know," Mason said, a hollow ache in his chest. "I have no idea where I'm going tomorrow." "Don't go back to your parents' house. Don't stay in this state," Kevin said. He handed Mason the envelope. "My company, the one I've been interning for, they offered me a full-time position at their international branch. It's a 3-year contract." Mason opened the envelope. Inside was a flight itinerary. Destination, Singapore. There were 2 names on the booking. Singapore. Mason breathed the word like it was a prayer. That's halfway across the world." "Exactly," Kevin said, stepping closer, his eyes searching Mason's. "No reminders. No shared history. No chance of seeing his face in a crowd or hearing his name in the news. Just the heat, the ocean, and a city that doesn't know who Mason and Alexander were." Mason looked at the ticket. He thought of the storyboard, the dark ink, and the cold air of the apartment. Then he looked at Kevin, his messy hair, his patient smile, and the way he had stood between Mason and a monster without blinking. "I'm not asking for anything, Mason," Kevin added quickly, misinterpreting Mason's silence. "We'll be roommates. You can find your own footing, get a job in a gallery, or just sit in the sun until you feel human again. I don't want to leave you here." Mason looked back at the university buildings, the stone walls that felt like the perimeter of a cage. He realized that if he stayed, he would always be the victim in everyone's eyes. In Singapore, he could just be Mason. "When do we leave?" Mason asked. Kevin's face lit up with a grin that was brighter than the afternoon sun. "Tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. Mason felt a strange, fluttering sensation in his chest, not the sharp thud of terror, but the light, dizzying lift of hope. He reached out and took Kevin's hand, squeezing it tight. "Okay," Mason said, a real smile finally breaking through the shadows of his face. "Let's go to Singapore." Chapter 8, The Warmth of the Equator. The air in Singapore was a physical embrace, thick, humid, and smelling of rain-slicked pavement and jasmine. It was a far cry from the biting chills and sterile hallways of Mason's old life. Here, the world was a riot of color, the neon glow of the super trees at gardens by the bay, the vibrant greens of the tropical canopy, and the shimmering glass of the skyline that seemed to reach for a future Mason had once thought was forfeit. 6 months had passed since they landed. Mason stood in the kitchen of their shared high-rise apartment, slicing a mango. The fruit was ripe and golden, its juice sticky on his fingers. He moved with a lightness that would have been unrecognizable to the shell of a man who had boarded that plane. The nightmares still came occasionally, shadows in the corners of his vision that looked like ink, but they were fading, drowned out by the constant, rhythmic hum of the city. He felt a presence behind him. Not the predatory, silent creep he used to fear, but the familiar, grounding weight of Kevin. "Smells good," Kevin said, leaning against the counter. He was wearing a light linen shirt, his skin tanned from weekend walks through the botanic gardens. He reached over and snagged a slice of mango, grinning when Mason swatted his hand away. "Get your own," Mason teased, though his heart did a soft, somber roll in his chest. They had settled into a comfortable, domestic rhythm. Kevin worked long hours at the tech firm, and Mason had found a job at a small contemporary gallery in Gilman Barracks. At first, Mason had been terrified to look at art, afraid of seeing a jagged line or a dark storyboard, but surrounded by the vibrant, abstract works of Southeast Asian artists, he had begun to reclaim his love for the visual world. He was no longer a character in someone else's drawing, he was the curator of his own reality. "Mace?" Kevin's voice turned uncharacteristically soft. Mason looked up. Kevin was watching him with an intensity that made the air feel suddenly still. "The sun is setting," Kevin said. "Come out to the balcony." They stepped out into the evening heat. Below them, the city was beginning to sparkle like a fallen constellation. The humidity clung to them, a warm blanket that felt safe rather than stifling. They sat in the wicker chairs they'd picked out together, not from a catalogue of perfect furniture, but from a dusty shop in Little India because they liked the way the wood smelled. "I've been thinking about something for a long time," Kevin started. He wasn't looking at Mason, he was looking at the distant cargo ships dotted across the Singapore Strait. "Actually, I've been thinking about it since before we even left." Mason felt a familiar flutter in his stomach, but for the first time, it wasn't born of anxiety. It was anticipation. "I love having you as a roommate, Mason," Kevin continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But I'd be lying if I said that's all I wanted. I've liked you for years. Long before everything. I brought you here because I wanted you to be safe, but also because I couldn't imagine being here without you." He finally turned to look at Mason, his eyes vulnerable. "I'm not asking for an answer today. Or next month. I know your heart has been through a war. I just wanted you to know that I'm here. And I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for the scars to feel like just skin again." Mason looked down at his wrists. In the soft twilight, the faint marks were invisible. He thought about the year of his life that had been stolen by a man who wanted to own him. Then he looked at Kevin, who was offering him the one thing Alexander never could, a choice. The silence on the balcony wasn't heavy. It was full of possibility. Mason reached across the small table and slid his hand over Kevin's. His skin was warm, his grip firm and real. "I used to think I was broken," Mason whispered, his voice catching. "But being here, with you, I'm starting to feel like I'm being put back together. Only, the pieces are in different places. Better places." He squeezed Kevin's hand, a slow, deliberate movement. "If you can wait for me to finish healing," Mason said, a tear of relief finally spilling over and trailing down his cheek, "I hope you'll accept the person I'm becoming. Because I think I'm finally ready to start a story that isn't written in ink, but in this." He gestured to the two of them, to the city, to the warm evening air. Kevin didn't lean in for a dramatic kiss. He didn't demand more. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers with Mason's, leaning back into his chair. "I'm not going anywhere, Mace," Kevin promised. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, giving way to the velvet blue of the tropical night. They sat there for a long time, Two men on a balcony half a world away from their ghosts, watching the lights of Singapore flicker to life, one bright, beautiful point at a time.